So one of the most requested topics we've had for the Marketing Summit series has been on podcast advertising. So I'm very excited to introduce Liz Horowitz, who is founder of Sonic Strategy Consulting, and she will lead a discussion on this topic with two prolific podcast advertisers, Mack Weldon CEO Brian Berger and Pretty Litter VP of Marketing Deanna Bershad. So Liz, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Secrets to Success in Podcast Advertising. Are we seeing the slides? Fantastic. So we've just introduced Brian and Deanna. I'm Liz Horowitz. I'm an advisor to businesses in the podcast space and brands who want to connect to podcast advertising or podcasts in some way. And my expertise is in business development and strategy from over 25 years being an advertising seller across digital and audio. And I am very passionate about podcasting. I am extremely passionate about advertising. So a discussion about podcast advertising may be one of my favorite topics to talk about. So to kick us off, we're going to do a very quick overview of the podcast landscape and podcast advertising. Over 100 million Americans listen to a podcast at least once a month, and 55% or 155 million have listened to a podcast, which is up from 40% in 2017, which is an increase of 38% in just 3 years. So that's pretty amazing to note. That trajectory continues to really increase year over year, which is why this is such a hot space. There is a somewhat even split between the genders, and about half of listeners are under the age of 35, and a little over half are over the age of 35. So why are podcast consumers so attractive to advertisers? It's really because of the extreme passion and engagement that listeners have for their favorite podcasts and podcast hosts, and that transfers to the sponsors. So podcast consumers have said that they approve of podcast advertising. 78% of listeners said that they approve of hearing podcast advertising. 67% say they remember brands and products from podcast ads. And 63% say they made a purchase after hearing podcast ads. So a little deeper dive into some of the reasons that podcast advertising does work. As we just mentioned, it's that native host endorsement that really transfers the podcast enthusiasm from the actual content to the advertiser. And in addition to that, it's such a transportable environment. It's a very personal, in-your-ear experience. There are very low ad loads. There is rare ad blocking, and it reaches that very hard to engage segment like millennials and cord cutters. So we are going to start our fireside chat with Brian and Deanna. I want to welcome both of you, and we're really excited to dive into our discussion.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, thanks. All right, Brian, we're going to start with you since you've been at this for some time. And I think we'd like to hear, how did you begin in podcast advertising, and how has that experience been for you and evolved over time?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. The origin of our podcast advertising really was a byproduct of, folks in our office, people on the team who were avid consumers of podcasts since the very early days. And as as time went on, it became clear that a kind of endorsement from a podcast host was, far superior in terms of making an impression than many of the other advertising channels that we were doing. And so what started out as really dipping, a very small toe in the water has become a very significant part of our marketing mix. But really the origin was just, we're spending a lot of time engaging with this content. We have a high degree of affinity for whomever the host or the personality is. And therefore, we're receiving whatever they tell us as way more effective than, something that's programmed or feels more like an ad, even though it's clearly some type of endorsement. And so that's really how it started. And then over time, it's just evolved into a much more robust, operation for us, where we're, now operating on a much bigger scale.
Terrific. Deanna, we want to hear your story as well. Pretty Litter is a new disruptive brand, and you have some big news to share. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Pretty Litter and your experience in podcast advertising?
Great. So similar to Brian, when I joined Pretty Litter, we were dipping our toes into the podcast world. We were sort of diverting a little bit of budget away from digital to test podcast. And in the last 12 months, we have grown our podcast spends by about 5x. So as Brian said as well, the personal endorsement you get from a host is unparalleled to any other channel. I can run a spot on television or on OTT, but I'm going to be 1 out of 7 other advertisers trying to catch somebody's attention. So with podcasting, it's people who listen to the podcast have a very good relationship with the host. People are focused, and a lot of times we are the only advertiser on there. So we have definitely been able to expand. One of the issues is, technology always moves faster than measurement. So before we were even sure the incrementality of podcasts, we had to start branching out. So over the last year, we focused on measurement, tracking, attribution. So for this year, we're really able to go big in the podcast channel.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is such a big issue for all of us testing a new medium. And podcasting has struggled with attribution. However, that is something that the ad tech has evolved exponentially just in the last couple of years. And there's really some great measurement tactics that we can use to figure out exactly what our attribution is. So, Brian, I know you've been very involved in that. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the tactics and strategies that you would characterize as secrets to your success and how you've measured over time?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of measurement, there really isn't, it's not necessarily a secret, but the 2 or 3 main ways, you attribute the ad spend on podcasting is typically either through the use of some sort of promo code, the use of a vanity URL, or the use of a post-conversion survey. And for us, we use the post-conversion survey for new customers on all orders, and it gets an unusually high engagement rate. It's like north of 50%. So it's not exact, but it's directionally accurate. And then we also use promo code redemptions and vanity URLs to track and attribute the ROI of a specific podcast. We find it to be pretty effective. Obviously the issue is that for a brand like ours that isn't promotional, we don't have sales and we don't ever use promotional levers in our marketing to drive engagement. This is a channel where we have to sort of make an exception in order to have any shot at understanding what the ROI is. And in addition to that, it's got a little bit of a higher hurdle to clear because those customers are coming in, those first-time customers are coming in, with some level of discount that is higher than a customer that's just coming in for the first time through another channel like Facebook or Google. So there are things like that you have to factor for into your ROI calculation. But it's a way to track the channel and sort of understand where it sits relative to the others.
Mm-hmm. And Deanna, what tactics are you using to track attribution?
So we use a mixture of a couple of different things. We use promo codes. As you know, those can be leaked to the affiliate sites quite easily. So we are very active looking at different affiliate sites, making sure that there's no promo leakage. We also use the post-purchase survey, and we actually diverted all of our paid traffic away from the homepage. So the traffic and conversions that are coming through the homepage are either through podcasts or television. So we're able to see the lift in traffic when those podcasts, deploy. The problem is, there's that little missing step on how many downloads, but then who actually listened to the podcast and when. So I'm hoping in the next year or two, we'll get a lot more tracking insights into who's actually listening to the podcast and when, and then we can attribute the behavior to that.
Okay. And can you tell us how this channel is comparing to other mediums in terms of response?
The response rate is fantastic for the podcast channel. Sometimes it's sort of unbelievable. The customers that we do bring in through podcasts are worth more money than some other channels. They have a very high stick rate. The average order value is very high. Overall, we definitely like the podcast orders coming in, and that's why we've created an incremental budget for podcasts instead of moving existing budget away from other channels.
Ah, terrific. Okay. And I also wanted to mention that you do have some big news, Deanna, because of the success of podcast advertising.
Yes.
Many other things as well. You've just gotten distribution into Target. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so we launched in Target early January. It was great when I joined Pretty Litter. People weren't really sure about the brand. Now, every time we mention it or talk to any prospective vendors, they say, oh, I heard about it on my favorite murder or true crime or all of these podcasts. So it's very exciting for us to be distributed in such, an amazing amount of retail stores, so young in our growth as a company. So it's been very exciting.
Yeah, terrific. And so, Brian, same question for you. How does this channel compare to other mediums in terms of response?
Yeah, we also find it to be very efficient for us. We have been able to scale it up. It's consistently amongst our highest in terms of, if we're just looking at it purely on a CPA basis. The customer quality is really good. And it does have the ability to make a brand impression over and above the direct conversion that, we feel is just very unique. It's one thing to route a customer through a very specific experience on a digital ad or a paid social ad. Here, you're really getting an endorsement from somebody that the customer really trusts, and they're able to put it in their own words and in their own context. And so in many ways, it makes a different kind of impression than just a visual, ad experience that a customer would typically have. And so both in terms of ROI and customer quality and, brand exposure, it's a channel that we're pretty excited about.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the trajectory. How has podcasting changed your overall media mix, and where is that budget coming from, Brian? Because Deanna mentioned that they had created an incremental budget for it. What has your experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, it was definitely incremental budget for us. I mean, we had to earmark something outside of our, existing marketing mix to evaluate this new channel. Now it is, it's growing and sort of living and dying by its success. And so we've scaled it from, low, double digit, low thousands of dollars to now much higher, 6 and 7 figure budgets. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's like any other channel. Once you're able to prove that it works, you're able to, scale it up incrementally, month over month, quarter over quarter, and next thing you know, it's a pretty significant part of your mix. The other cool thing about it is that as it gets bigger, you're able to test, different types of shows. There's, the one challenge I would say is that it's just a harder channel to manage and scale up. There's a lot more involved logistically in executing campaigns than there is just sort of throttling up a digital spend, you know, in a dashboard. And so, you know, we've been able to test bigger shows and understand the impact of, you know, maybe bigger reach and, you know, slightly more expensive versus cobbling together, you know, the longer tail of smaller shows that may be more targeted, but a bit harder to manage. And I think we're sort of reached a happy medium there.
Okay, terrific. All right, so over time, we see habituation can impact results. What practices have you implemented to refresh your strategy? For example, how often do you introduce new podcasts or tweak creative or other best practices? So Brian, you spoke just now about doing some test and learn. Anything else you want to add to that?
I mean, the strategy on creative has been consistent since the very early days, which is let the host do their, if it's an endorsement read by the host, let them do their thing, let them put it in their voice. You know, you can put together a bulleted list of the, you know, of the major high points you want them to cover. But the best performance always comes when you let the host do their thing. Even if it's a show that you think is a really great fit and a personality that's like right in the bullseye, if you try and script it too much, the performance just will not show up. So really just letting the host do their thing, I would say, is our biggest, you know, direction in terms of creative type. And we don't really change that very much.
Gotcha. All right. And Deanna, what about your test and learn experiences?
So we're constantly testing. Most of 2020 was trying to test as many shows as possible. So we had a big segment of core programs going into 21. We test new shows every single month. It's a little bit difficult because true crime works so well for us. So it's hard for us sometimes to pivot away from true crime and test into different audiences when we know that true crime will work. So we do adjust our message based on the audience. Having a host read is fantastic. A lot of the hosts do have cats and use our product, so it comes off as very authentic. But we are constantly updating scripts with new bullet points, talking about maybe seasonality. If you're stuck in your home, you want a product delivered to you. So we're constantly updating messages based on the audience, and then testing new shows, even with hosts that don't have cats or in completely different demographics. And we're finding even, you know, younger male-focused comedy shows perform just as well with that demographic as true crime performs with the female demographic. So it's been really great to have the scale. And what's fantastic about podcasts is there's new shows all the time. So there's never any lack of inventory avails, which happens a lot in other channels.
Right, right. All right, so this question is something that just came in. I wanted to pose it to both of you. How long did it take for you to see results?
Now, overall in the podcast channel or from a specific show?
As you started up testing podcasting as a medium, how long did it take for you to see that this channel could pay out, that it had a successful ROI?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, for us, we get most of the performance within the first couple of days of the show dropping. Podcast does have a longer lead time. So we do look at it at a rolling 4-week basis. So we can see all of, you know, the drag coming in. When we first started out, there were a lot of shows that didn't cause any response. We got no response whatsoever. But, you know, you weren't able to just quit the channel and say, okay, this isn't going to work for me. We had to make sure that we were testing enough different audiences and different messages to really give this channel a chance.
Yeah, I would say same thing. I mean, you know, certain shows that are, you know, episodic, like some of the true crime stuff that Deanna talked about, you know, there's a bit more of a shelf life on those, and things that are more news oriented, you know, have a shorter, you know, timeline. And so we too look at it, you know, on a rolling basis, just because, you know, people, even if it is a show that is, you know, current, you know, news oriented show, it does, not everybody listens to it the minute it comes out. So there is a bit of a delay there, but you understand the ROI within a relatively short window.
Gotcha. Okay, so Brian, what about genres that have worked for Mack Weldon?
Genres, we have seen success: sports, business, general interest news, comedy. So go figure, cat litter and, men's apparel, all, coexisting there. I will add something that is kind of unique for us. Another reason why we like this channel is it enables us to micro-segment audiences that are much harder to target on programmatic marketing. So an algorithm will optimize to wherever the conversions are, and that's usually, for us, it's usually guys. And so, for example, if we wanted to target women as purchasers of our products, as gifters or primary purchasers, podcast has been a great place for us to do that. So, some channels around entertainment and other things have been helpful there.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to have to start wrapping up, but I want to thank you both for joining us and sharing your secrets. Any final parting thoughts on any other secrets that we haven't dug out of you yet that you want to share? Any advice to brands who are going to dip their toe into the podcast waters?
I mean, we got up to 100 shows without having any agency involvement. I would highly recommend that, really understanding the channel on a first party basis before you bring a third party in. I would recommend that. I know we talked about it in the prep, Tina, and I had a similar point of view, which is, understand the channel first before you outsource it and this is a channel where ultimately you do, once you get to a certain scale, you really do need some other hands to help you manage it. But really understand it first.
Mm-hmm.
Deanna, what about you?
I would just say keep testing, keep trying different audiences, keep trying different demographics, because the podcast channel is really a great place for conversion.
That's what everyone wants to hear, because we need channels that work for us, and this one is an amazing channel. I can personally say that I don't mind hearing the podcast ads because they're part of the content. A lot of times they're just as entertaining as the content. So thank you both for joining us, and I believe that will wrap up our secrets to podcast advertising for today. Thanks
so much.
Thank you so much.